We're live in 3, 2, 1.
What's up, guys? Welcome to the Podcast Explain.
What are you doing?
What are you doing? You're a guest on my Podcast Explain.
No, I invited you to be a guest on my Inside Podcast.
No, we are doing my podcast on podcast right now.
No one listens to your podcast about podcasts. That's why you're on my podcast, Inside Podcast. You can promote your podcast about podcasts to my podcast audience.
I actually have a very loyal podcast following on Patreon.
Who puts up a paywall on their first podcast episode?
I'm sorry, not all of us can have podcast ad sponsors on our first podcast.
Sorry, not all of us have parents who just went missing.
What?
Your whole family just disappeared, and you were the last one to see them, with no alibi.
What are you talking about? You're my alibi. I've been here with you in this podcast studio doing these podcasts. I have an alibi. You're my alibi.
Did Jeffrey kill his entire family? Are they all just ghosts? Speaking of ghosts, a word from our sponsor, Casper Mattresses.